Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Hayes Interviews. This is episode number 4. In the previous episode, I talked to Clive Foster about his book, The Everything List: Your Future in a Tokenized World. And in the next episode, I'm going to be talking to Teresa Coraggio about her book, How to Dismantle an Empire. But today, I'm very honored to be talking with Diana Mora Henry, who wrote this book, I Am Andre, which I've been reading. I'll confess up front, I've only finished part 1. And so I'll tell everybody now this is likely going to be a 2-part interview. Today, we're going to discuss part 1, the first part of the book, and then we'll have a follow-up call once I've managed to find a time to finish reading the book, because there's so much in here. And we had a little introductory call last night, and we were thinking about how we're gonna what we're gonna focus on, and there's so much to cover that I thought let's just have 2 conversations about it, right? And so Diana, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Nick. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm very happy as well. So this book, I Am Andre, this is from the life of Andre Joseph Scheinman. And the top here, it's we got a little subtitle: German Jew, French resistance fighter, and British spy. So this is part memoir, and then it's part history. And I think it's an amazing slice of history. This particular edition, which is by Chiselbury, is a beautiful paperback. And I'll just give a little preview of inside. There's all these color representations of various pictures and documents and drawings. It's a really, for the history buffs out there, it's a real piece of, I always call books treasure. It's a real piece of treasure because there's so much in there to give you a sense and a feel of the time and the man and the situations he was in. So the first thing I want to ask really, and take as long as you need, to tell this story to answer this question, but how did you come to learn about Andre, and how did you come to decide that his story needed to be immortalized in a beautiful, colorful paperback? And I think there's a hardback version as well, if I'm not mistaken. But this just happens to be the one I've got. So yeah, how did this all come about?
Uh, well, it can go back a ways, but to answer your question, as soon as I met Andre, I and heard his story from him, I thought it should be a book. So, but I can go back because it really starts with my seeing the Natzweiler concentration camp, which I first visited in 1985. And it was during a trip to Alsace with my father to visit his father's home country. And while we were there, our guide, who was the head of B'nai B'rith in Europe, said, "Do you want to see the concentration camp?" We were traveling right around Strasbourg, the little towns around Strasbourg. And my father and I looked at each other, and what passed between us was no. And then we both turned to, George Block and said, "Oh, yes, that would be so interesting." So we were rewarded for our hypocrisy by a really unique visit to the camp at a time when it was it was already a French historic monument, but it had not been, exploited the way it is now with a sort of giant museum to the resistance in Europe and all the other concentration camps and so on. And the buildings were closed, but we toured. The site is very well preserved, as I understand it, in terms of the concentration camps, the Nazi concentration camps. So, for instance, all the original, or maybe not original, but the barbed wire enclosure is all there, and the guard towers. 4 of the barracks remain, and there's the gas chamber is there, which I understand is the only gas chamber that remains, in the camp, so you can see the way it functioned. and the way the commandant, looked through the window and poured in the, mixture, the ingredient that would make the gas. And, so it's quite a remarkable site. And we didn't see the gas chamber when we went the first time. But, we stood on that howling mountaintop, and it occurred to me that, in a sense, I never left that place since then, because, I started corresponding with the survivors. I went to the commemorative ceremonies. I visited with a school group. The first time I visited was 85. Then I went at the invitation of a survivor, Eugene Marlowe, to visit again in 91. Then I went to the commemoration ceremonies in 98, where the survivors gathered, and also where Eugene Marlowe's ashes were strewn on the camp. And I had started to uh, correspond, as I said, with the survivors, and also to speak at academic conferences about the camp, translate the memoirs. So at my 25th reunion from Harvard, where I did study history,
Hmm.
um, we have for our reunions at Harvard, the big reunions, the college publishes a book of our autobiographies, what we've been thinking, what we've been doing. Some people write nothing. In my class, Al Gore and Tommy Lee Jones never write anything.
Okay.
Fine, but they've done other things. But so I wrote that I'd been studying the Natzweiler concentration camp, and Andre's son called me. He was a classmate, and he said, "I see you must have been reading every bio in there." And he said, "I see that you've been studying Natzweiler. My father was a camper at Natzweiler. I think you should meet him." So I was thrilled, because I was trying, by that time, 94, people were getting on in
Hmm.
age, and I was making every attempt I could to meet all of the American survivors of the camp. It was
And I'll just mention as well that you say in the book, this is the first time you'd heard the word camper
Yeah,
used, right? Which you always think like happy campers or going camping. So, yeah, I'm sure that it was quite, took you off guard a little bit and made you pay attention.
did. It caught my attention, and I did go to lunch at Michel's house with his dad and his wife, lovely lunch. And his dad, uh, quite I think the term that you used in our first meeting was chivalrous. He's very chivalrous and very, very gentle, but gallant demeanor. And he described his story, and he said, "I've written a memoir. I think I'm going to publish it, for the family." And I said, "Oh, it's such a unique story. I think you should let me find a real publisher for it."
Hmm.
And he agreed. You know, both of us, I think, there was very little that escaped him in terms of any kind of subtlety. So I think he fully realized that I had no experience getting books published. But he entrusted the manuscript to me, which was, as you said, it was the memoir part of the book, the first part of the book.
Hmm.
So it had been dictated, English was his third language. So, there were many Gallicisms in it, and probably some German subtleties that I couldn't pick up because I don't speak German. So my first effort was to go through the book and to break it down, take out the duplications, of course, edit it, and break it down into chapters, into paragraphs even. There were no paragraphs. And then I asked him for his CV, which was not part of the book. I guess it just hadn't occurred to him. And he he wrote a marvelous CV, which you have seen probably in the book. There's a couple of pages of it that he dashed off on his wife's stationery, Mrs. Andre Scheinman, and he crossed out Mrs. So, because she was deceased at that point. So, but his CV was presented so flawlessly, for a handwritten note of just the essentials of his main networks, his main MI6 contacts, his handler, Thomas Green, and his handler's boss, Biffy Wilfred Dunderdale, who was head of the French section of MI6. It was just so impeccably presented. And so I was lucky that I did ask him for that, and he approved the way I had edited it, brought it down into chapters, and then we chose the title. I said, I think it should be I Am Andre, because you became Andre during the war. I mean, born Joseph Scheinman, but he said he had trained himself so that if anyone called out the name Joseph, he wouldn't even respond. He wouldn't turn his head or bat an eye, because he really was Andre during the war, a pseudonym, an alias that the French army had given him when he enlisted in the French army, because he was, he had a German name.
Hmm.
And the French army, like the Foreign Legion, often gave their enlistees, if they had a foreign name that resembled the enemy's identity, they would give false identities to prevent if their soldiers were captured, from being summarily executed, and give them the rights to be treated as prisoner of war rather than traitors. Because with a name like Joseph Scheinman, the Germans would have, even if they hadn't detected that he was Jewish, they would have detected a German nationality, or formerly German, because he gave up his German nationality.
Hmm.
But we'll talk about that. So that's, did I cover how I came to write this? I mean, that was 94. It took me, another 30 years to present the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
No,
like,
that's perfect.
yeah,
It's a wonderful background, and it's amazing that you got to meet him as well. And I'll just show this
yeah,
wonderful picture. This is just the second page of the book, and you mentioned that he not a lot got past him, right? He knew people. He knew people, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to get to where he got. I don't think he would have survived without a very deep knowledge of people, and so you could obviously see that you were authentic and you cared and you were so interested, and you really wanted to get his story out. And so despite your lack of publishing experience and know-how, I'm sure he could tell that you were the right person for the job. And so yeah, here we are now with the finished article 30 years later, and the time, the love, the care, the attention, it really shows. Because as we mentioned a little bit last night, the book is very well referenced. There's a lot of end notes that are to other books and documents and explanations about things. And so I suppose when this is my next question is when I read and finished and got to the end of part one, I'm almost sitting back thinking, this is like almost unbelievable, right? This, just the level of courage and bravery and daring do and intelligence, and to get through everything that he got through in this, in here in 2026. It's hard to imagine people had that level of guile to be able to manage these situations and these people and these relationships, and just to be able to train yourself not to respond to your given name is that shows on its own an incredible strength of character. And so what was your, when you first heard the story, were you thinking, oh, maybe he's embellishing a little bit, maybe he's pumping himself up a little bit? Did you have any kind of reservations at first, or did you tell straight away this guy is the real deal and he's authentic? What was that like?
That's a great question. I didn't have the slightest doubt from the beginning.
Hmm.
I really did. And but your reaction, I mean, your reaction is something that I enjoy. You know, how do you stay on a project for 30 years? I mean, you know, it's got to be interesting, right? And I think that discovering, you know, that he really was who, you know, he said he was and did all the things he said he did, and I'm sure much more that we'll never know.
Hmm.
But you know, it's kind of like working on the book and researching it was a little like researching the Scarlet Pimpernel, if you know that book. And if the Scarlet Pimpernel were, do you know the Scarlet Pimpernel is this story? It's a novel of daring do of a man who seems an incredibly foppish aristocrat, British aristocrat, and it's at the time of the French Revolution, and he dedicates himself to extracting French aristocrats from France and bringing them to England to save their lives. But he, you know, he disguises himself, and one of his disguises is to be, you know, a foppish, lightweight.
So nobody would suspect him,
No,
kind of like a Clark Kent type of role, right? This
right.
nerdy person who could never be a hero.
No one suspects him, and you know, even his wife or whatever, they disdain him, and and you know, Andre had that. I mean, it's an imposter story. I think spy stories are, you know, basically imposter stories,
Hmm.
and I've always loved imposter stories. But you know, Andre did. I mean, he had uncles, great uncles, who were world class illusionists. And I don't know if you've gotten to that part yet, but there's, you know, there's that sort of family trait of, you know, of presenting an illusion that people, that charms and hypnotizes people. And you know, Andre never told me about these uncles, and neither
Hmm.
did his son. So it was only when I met his cousin that I found out about that. But you know, it's quite an interesting family story in itself. And then you know, Andre's personality was uh, you know, I mean, he carefully evaluated what people wanted to hear, what they could understand, what was in their interest. So, for instance, the photograph that you showed, the beginning photograph of the book of him is from his interview for the Steven Spielberg Holocaust survivor interviews.
Hmm.
And it's an interesting interview, and he does have some great moments in it. But basically, the woman who was interviewing him had been at Auschwitz and had no idea that people could have this kind of Holocaust journey. And, you know, it was obvious she never heard about Notzweiler. And, you know, I mean, it was almost like she didn't believe him. And he was in a kind of a dead state for most of that interview. That photograph, you know, the screenshot that I managed to capture, you know, really does show him, you know, wide awake. And but part of being wide awake for him was to know who he was talking to,
Hmm.
and so he didn't present things to people that they wouldn't understand or could. So, you know, at one point in the book, it's quite touching. Uh, he uh, he enrolled in the university in the Rennes in German studies as a disguise or an explanation of why his German was so absolutely perfect.
Hmm.
And because it was essential for his role as a translator, which is how he managed to, you know, rise to such an important position. in, intelligence gathering for the British. But, so this excuse of enrolling in the university in German studies, advanced German studies, brought him into contact inevitably with young women. And, inevitably, probably a love affair. And the young woman wanted to draft him into her network,
Hmm.
network. And he said, I can't do that. I have an important job at the railroad. I can't jeopardize my work situation.
I remember that
So
bit. Yeah.
actually presenting himself as a dull bureaucrat, who really had no other but, material interests.
Yeah, that's a really good example. It was a wonderful episode, and he knew that at that point it would be better for them to
Yeah.
go their separate ways, right? And this
Well,
is and this comes up again and again actually in the first part is where he's managing situations and people and relationships and setting expectations and finding that, like you mentioned, finding what people want even when they're enemies, even when there's a prisoner and a guard situation, or it's about he knew, okay, where can we get everybody's needs met here to the best outcome that you could think of, because not every case would be able to be resolved. And he says as well later on in the book that there were times when he had people's lives in his hands because of some of the decisions he had to make. But that ability to kind of survey the landscape and really not fall into the hatred or the bitterness or the resentfulness, to maintain a sense of composure in extreme circumstances, to calculate what's going to be the best outcome for everybody involved here, is quite an astonishing skill and characteristic. And I think that comes through like that shines all the way through, right? It's certainly like a theme. So let's rewind a little bit and talk sort of about his youth, his childhood, and how he ended up in France, right? Because he one of the aspects of the story that I was quite amazed by as well was that when he got to France, um, he and his dad went to join the French army, and so it shows that the characteristics he had kind of ran in the family, and that links into the this what you were saying about his great uncles being illusionists and wanting to. It's clearly quite a remarkable family. But yeah, his childhood, his upbringing, ending up in France, and then ending up working in the French railroad. That was I think it's a really key part of the story because that's how his experiences kind of shape how he then made it through what was to come.
yeah, I think that, the family influences were very important, especially his father's. I mean, I mean, it was a military family. On his mother's side, there were professional army men in the Polish army. On her side, of distinction, actually, uh, for Jews. And then his father, fought in World War I on the side of the Germans. And, but as soon as Hitler raised his ugly head in 1924, after the putsch, his father started to travel around Germany speaking at veterans organizations against Hitler from 1924, which was also the year that his father took out a visa for France.
Hmm.
So I think not only, I mean, I think his father could be considered part of the German resistance to Hitler. And uh, but it also illustrates the characteristic of Andres, which I think was important for his survival, although he always said luck played a huge part in every survival or death, but the ability to be realistic about the danger, and that his father saw so early on that he needed to take out visas for the family for France.
Mhm.
So that as soon as Hitler came to power in 1933, they were out of there. The family left, and yeah. So I think that all those strands play into what you're describing as the characteristics that helped him to proceed to his adventure and helping so many people. And coming back to what you were mentioning about picking the best, trying to act in everyone's best interests in very difficult situations. And whether I actually always believed Andre's story, um, yes, I believed him, but I was very keen to get the documentation. And the first part of that came to me as the books in which he was mentioned, which Andre didn't know. He didn't know any of the books where he had been mentioned. And in fact, the survivors of Natzweiler and survivors of the resistance, I found about 15 or 20 books that mentioned him by name or by alias. Uh, and that was really important. And one of those was a book by three communist prisoners at Natzweiler. And, Andre describes them in his memoir as that they would have killed him if they could have. The communists were a very strong contingent in the camps and very much dedicated to each other's survival and to the survival of anyone who would promise to join them on the other side. So, but those three communists wrote a book which describes him in several episodes, like little chapters about the interpreter, Andre, and how he would often distract the Germans who were in a frenzy, a sadistic frenzy, or orgiastic frenzy. And he would distract the Germans and, often receiving the boot in the behind, but taking the brunt of their sadism away from their intended victim. So these testimonies are very important in, not just for me, because I already was totally on board, but because I knew him, but for the future, I felt that, I really had to nail it down. And then when the archives opened, it was critical that I could find so many documents, both in the French and the British archives. Did
Yeah,
I?
I'm reminded of another episode as well in the camp where he they had groups, working groups called commandos, right, with
Yeah.
a K.
Yeah.
And he ended up running a commando group which was working on a road that needed to be adjusted because the corner was too sharp. So trucks were overturning and cars were overturning as they were going round, right? And he describes how they would plan the work in such a way as that they could kind of relax, but then when they saw the guard coming,
Mm.
they would snap to it, and and then the trees would fall down, and then the wheelbarrows would be picked up and moved. And so um and so in this way people could rest. And another story in there is about how the lists of who was sick would be falsified, and people who weren't quite sick but were getting there would be admitted so that they could eat and rest and sort of recover before they got to the point where they would usually be admitted into, the hospital or the tent or the barracks where
End of
sick.
life.
Right. So these little adjustments, it's looking at the system and seeing, okay, what have we got to work with? How can we mislead, misdirect? How can we pull attention over here? It is kind of like an illusion, right? One hand's doing this while the other hand's doing something over here, and it's and that shines through again. And so these stories are priceless. Really, they're amazing. I'll be honest, I've never read much documentation or books about this era, World War II at all. I've been since I've been running my channel and caring a bit more about books and history, I've gone a little bit further back to sort of Cecil Rhodes and Lord Milner and the lead up to World War One and the establishment of uh, Royal Institute for International Affairs, and so I'm still very inexpert in this area. And so to read, this is really my first account of what it's like to be in this kind of situation, to be in a concentration camp, to what the dynamics were like. You mentioned the communists had their group, and there was German prisoners in there, and so that brings me to another point that I noticed that came out about Andre to me when I was reading is that when he was born, of course, he was born in Germany, and he talks about as Hitler was coming to power and his father seeing the writing on the wall, and he assembled all the other Jewish children his age, and he said, "Right, let's kind of take care of each other because things are going to get bad for us here." So he was organizing meetings, but the bit that stood out to me was that how nonplussed and kind of confused he was that he was no longer. He always thought if there was a war, he would fight for Germany, and he
Mhm.
had this idea in his head that he was German and that he would, if it came to it, that would be where he would fight. And then, of course, that didn't happen, and they had to leave, and they went to France, and then he signed up and fought for France, and so this sort of multiple identity, right? Joseph Scheinman becomes Andre, the German, fights for the French, and then works for the British. It's amazing that he could hold all these sort of identities and keep his identity true as a thread through all that, right? Playing these different roles, the interpreter and the train, the number two at the train service, and the sort of secret agent, and all this. It's just all the hats he wore and all the identities. But that seems to have been part and parcel from a very young age. He was having to do that because how old was he when he had to leave France? He was a sort of teenager, was it?
Yeah, I think he was 17, maybe something like that. Yeah, 17. And yeah, it's a fascinating story of identity. I mean, a lot of people now, feel that they have the wrong identity.
Yep.
You, it's I mean, this was seriously being a Jew in Europe was, the wrong identity at the time.
Hmm.
And it probably always has been just more or less the wrong identity, but also the right one, of course. But he had this sense that I guess of an impeccable integrity and core of that he could do a lot in the world, uh, with whatever skills he had, and he did he did organize. Some people find that part about his organizing the self-help group and the for the Jewish children and their parents, the telephone tree, and
Hmm.
you know rejecting um, rejecting going to the school had said that all students had to go to a Hitler parade.
Oh, that's right.
And he said, he went to the principal and he said, no, we don't, we Jewish children should not have to go to, cheer Hitler. And, the principal was like, what? Well, I'll have to check back on that with you. And then eventually they got the word that, in fact, no, the Jewish children were not supposed to go. But that word came from, the German, from the Nazis. And in the meantime, Andre had tried to organize the parents to, refuse to have their children go, pay homage to Hitler. And he found that there was no support for that
Right.
initiative. That in fact, the Jews, parents wanted their children to, fit in and be part of the society as they always had been, or had been, in the last decades. And that they, so I think Andre got a really good schooling in that experience that, that there wasn't going to be a consensus of resistance and that, he had to act on his own the way his father had. So,
And it's got kind of parallels to the present day in a sense, in that a lot of the parents he was trying to rouse and get to see what he was seeing and his father was certainly seeing. They didn't want to. They had a sort of denial. We'll be all right. We're German. We'll be fine. Uh, and it's a kind of head in the sand, not wanting to accept what's coming and what's about to happen, which I think can be said of the present day when we're on the edge of a very dystopian digital control system that seems to be getting built and rolled out at an intense speed. And for more information on that, my last two interviews, Patrick Wood and Courtney Turner, and then Clive Foster was talking. Their books are talking about this, but trying to get the average person in your family or friendship group or at work to see this is very, very challenging, and it can be quite isolating and lonely to be able to see that writing on the wall, but then not be able to get others to see it. And so it's you can empathize with his situation, his family situation, his father's situation for sure in that sense, right?
yeah, it's really, it's not just a Jewish story. It's in fact the story of any, of any place where people's freedoms are threatened. And, the totalitarian onslaught is in progress. And, everyone is going to have to decide, first they have to see the danger. They have to see the danger. And then they have to, if they can, resist. Yeah.
Well, I think in that and with that said, this is why this book is so inspirational and so timely and so powerful and appropriate for anybody to read who is certainly interested in the topics I talk about on the channel or the heroism, that like I said, the tales of daring do, the chivalry, the taking matters into one's own hands and not simply following orders, right? Really having that moral compass of what is right and wrong, being realistic, being facing the danger, facing the truth and reality of the situation, but still maintaining your own listening to your own conscience and allowing that to guide you and sticking to it is a really important lesson, I think, that many people need to take on board seriously.
May I say, just as a little footnote to the story of the road building
Yeah.
episode and so on, that this kind of tactic of being able to seem as if you were moving without really moving, because every calorie, mattered so much in a starvation situation. So yeah, Andre was organizing people so that the people who were the sickest and the weakest could move the least, and the scenario would be set. That does come up in other stories of the camps, that it was a skill that was cultivated.
Hmm.
By people, if people survived more than 3 months in the camp, they developed some skills like those. And so that wasn't so much unique Although Andre, I'm sure, wasn't reading other books on the camp,
No.
just other people were coping. But but still, what I think at the end of that, or when he talks about how the you know, he would, the old guards who were on those road commandos or whatever would be, you know, he understood that they had been retired from the Eastern Front, and they were old soldiers, and they were overworked, you know, 18-hour a day work days, and they wanted to do was sleep and be warm, and he'd build a fire for them, and he'd say, you know, just, you know, we'll wake you up when we see the SS coming, you know, so
Hmm.
that, you know, you can do your thing. And, you know, so he was protecting them and assured them that no one would escape. But when the SS came, and this fearsome, really a sadistic man who is known to have killed, you know, more than 300 prisoners at the camp, you know, when he came along and said, you know, do they always work this well, you know, for you when I'm not here? And Andre had this, I think this was kind of a way, that he could connect with his, you know, as you're saying, you know, you know, that with all these false identities, he somehow allowed himself sometimes to connect with the truth. And, you know, he said to them, the SS, no, of course they don't work this way. They're not here. You know, it's like, you know, and the man, you know, respected him for that, and took it, because, you know, Andre could connect with people on a level of a falsehood, but also on a level of truth, you know, that, and he knew the difference. He knew when he could allow the truth to come out of his mouth.
That's a really good episode. I'm glad you reminded me of that one and mentioned it because um again, that speaks to that knowledge of people and being able to sense who you can push it a little bit with. Who's going to appreciate a very candid admission and frank admission like that versus who's going to go into fits of outrage and cause more pain and strife for Andre and the crew, right? So it's about sizing people up and being able to tell who you can get away with that sort of thing with. And that's amazing. And it's another one of those skills that I feel is missing these days because we spend so much time on the screens and looking at our phones and on the internet and messaging and typing and we're not writing letters, right? One of the beautiful things about all the artifacts that you've reproduced in the book is all this handwriting and the stamps and just that old school way of writing things down, which just seems to be a dying art these days. But it's also we're losing the ability to read each other's body language and facial expressions, and not only that, but just the energetic, field that we have and other people have, the electrical field of the heart and the brain that is quite a size, right? You can sense people and you can kind of there's an unspoken sensing that goes on when you're physically together. Less so when you're separated by cables and screens and wires and Wi-Fi and all this stuff nowadays. So it's a real amazing account of somebody who could meet people and recognize them and connect with them and see them, really see people and see past the uniform, see past the nationality, see past the political alliance, and that's really refreshing and really inspirational to me in a time when we're divided, when it's like the red team and the blue team, it's the atheists or the theists, and if you're both theists, then it's the Christians and against the Muslims, and if you're both Christian, then it's the the Catholics against and it's just divide all the way down. What label are you? What group? What do you belong to? Dare I say it? What camp do you belong to? And so that's another aspect that makes him such a fascinating person is that he could respect that and honor it when he needed to, but then he could also cut through it. And I think that's what people would appreciate. Certainly that guard, that moment, that candid moment where he just said, no, of course they don't. Like, I could imagine that that's just such a human moment, human to human. And for
Yeah.
a second, and I could see why that would, work. But you got to have some real emotional intelligence to know when you can and can't get away with that sort of thing, right?
And he could use that seeming, that understanding of people's needs and different cultures. I mean, he understood the German culture, you know, perfectly because, he'd lived in it. And like you said, he didn't even want to leave Germany when his parents left. I mean, he wanted to stay on,
Mhm.
be German. And, finally he did, leave at the same time. But when the German high command would, want to borrow him as interpreter to visit their installations, their secret installations, the U-boat bases and so on, and use him as an interpreter, he would present a factitious, semblance of respecting, his job, and saying, well, I don't know if I can get away to. Of course, this was priceless information he was going to be gathering for MI6. But he made a pretense of saying, I have, I don't know if my boss is going to let me
Yeah,
go.
that's right.
So for 3 weeks, you want me to travel with you to the airfields and your fuel depots and what? I mean, and then his boss, who was an MI6 man from way back, maybe probably even before the war, would go through the same rigmarole of, this is he's a valuable assistant. What,
Yeah, I can't do without him for 3 weeks. You want to take him away? What are you talking about? And make a show of it, rolling your eyes like, no, I can't. Yeah, it's genius that kind of bluff, right? That double bluff when actually you need to get on this like 3 week trip to the airfield so you can gather that intel.
being over it, but it was like, wow. So yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, yeah, and there's so many of those little anecdotes in there. One that I mentioned to you yesterday, one of my favorite ones, and this isn't so much about Andre, but it was just about the time was the French when the Germans occupied the place where Andre was living in France. I forget the name of it now, but he tells the anecdote about how every Saturday night, all the young people in the university town, and they would all go to the cinema. And at this time, it was when you had the double matinees, and so there would be a film and then a break and then a film. And is it right that what happened in the break, they were showing some German propaganda between the films?
Call them newsreels. So this was before I even remember newsreels from before, TV really. And, so it was like a news program,
Okay.
but it involved, always the German successes.
Right. And then as a wonderful, another excellent example of the spirit of resistance and how innovative and creative you have to be. The people were deciding they didn't want to sit through this like pro-German news programming, and so they would stand up and leave and go outside for a cigarette for this intermission. And then pretty soon the Germans said, "Okay, no more leaving between, right? You got to stay inside." And so they all brought newspapers along. And then, this newsreel would start and they would get the newspapers out, start reading their papers. And then newspapers got banned. And so they started booing loudly so nobody could hear it. And then booing got banned. And then they started applauding and cheering. And that was amazing to me. Just the idea, that ingenuity, and like, okay, well, fine, we'll follow the rules, and then
Yeah,
coming up with something else, and ultimately settling on this thing that they can't ban because you're cheering, right? But they were cheering so loud and making such a ruckus that nobody could hear what was being said from the through the news program anyway. Just it's a fantastic anecdote. And I think there's so many of those little stories and that just encapsulate heroism and bravery and courage in the face of something that is potentially, devastatingly terrible. And so that's another reason why I think it's a fantastic book for anybody who's feeling kind of on the side of, you know,
Hopeless-
pardon?
Hopelessness.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. Exactly. So yeah, I wanted to make sure we mentioned that. So
Yeah, and actually, and I do try to get it in, if not in the book, then in the footnotes or the endnotes, which are a whole other book. Um, you know, the fact that Brittany, where he was, which is, right across the channel from England, was actually the most dedicated to the resistance of all parts of France.
oh,
And
really?
very early on. So this was, when Andre was operating in his networks, which didn't, the agents in the networks really, most of them, they knew that there was some kind of, let me just change the shade here. They
Hmm.
knew that they knew that their information, their intelligence was getting to London, but they didn't know. Um, they didn't they didn't really parse that out as to where London, what that represented, and except that it was the only free country in Europe, and or not in Europe, but close by, whatever you think. But um, only the leaders, maybe, of the networks realized that they were in communication with, MI6 or secret intelligence, and not with De Gaulle for most of these early networks. De Gaulle didn't have the,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
I do try to get a little bit of that kind of information about the history in to 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 give the Bretons their due, that they were considered maybe half of the French resistance.
Yeah. That's fantastic, and that's it. That's why it's such a great book for fans of history, and all the artifacts and evidence that you've provided to flesh out the context and remind people of what it was like then, because we're getting to the point where pretty soon there won't be many people who live through it. Right, we're right on the edge of that, like you mentioned at the start. You were realizing that time was sort of running out to meet these people and talk to them and get that firsthand account, which is so important given the way that we're kind of misled, or the way that history is can be rewritten or written. They say history is written by the victors, right? And so there's so much that makes it into the schooling and the university courses and there's so much that's left out as well. And so this is why it's great to have threads. I always call them threads to pull on, that people can go further after reading your book or while reading your book even, and they can pull on these threads, find these other books and these other avenues of study, and just deepen their understanding of the time and the man and the situations. But to return back to his story a little bit, we've given a sort of overview. We didn't touch on how he ended up in Natzweiler. Is that I think it's worth mentioning that little bit of the story, because of course, such a big part of this memoir is how he made it through this situation in Natzweiler. But how did he end up there?
Yeah, well, I think there's a quote in the book about how betrayal was the daily bread of the resistance. And, it really is remarkable to have a career as long as Andre was able to sustain it in resistance. I mean, 15 months is a long time
Hmm.
for a network or an operative. And he did go to England. He was brought over to England by, MI6 and Special Operations Executive, and people who were aspiring to work with De Gaulle, who were working with De Gaulle. So there's sort of the three-part special secret services that were operating in his world. but he was in England for training at the beginning in January of 1942. But when he returned, um, he, he first went and secreted his treasure of 500,000 French francs, which MI6 had given to him to create new networks of his choice,
Hmm.
which was intelligence. He was not into sabotage, and he had to engineer sabotage or facilitate it in his career. But he preferred intelligence, so he managed to do a switcheroo where he turned over hundreds of his saboteurs to special operations executive and the De Gaulle networks. And then he, who really wanted only to work with MI6, ended up with a new mission of simply constituting the intelligence network that he wanted. And he had a large funding, large amount of money. And he got that when he came back from England. He got that all hidden away until after the end of the war, and when he returned it, which is a whole other stuff.
Hmm.
And then he showed back up at work, and someone warned him as he was approaching the train station. They said, "All your buddies have been arrested." And he made a mistake, when he says it. I was overconfident, and a spy should never be overconfident. And so he made a split second decision, which was one of his rare errors, but a huge error. You know, he thought, and he explains, I thought I could be even more valuable if I overcome their suspicions,
Hmm.
and and then I will be even more valuable to MI6.
It was a risky gambit, wasn't it? For sure.
Gamble failed, and I mean, he tried to tell the Germans that he'd really gone to England only to check out and see if his girlfriend was getting married.
Yeah, that was such a great that story. Yeah, it was he'd fallen in love and then he heard on the radio
Oh,
a girl with the same name was getting married, but he didn't know the first name. So he
right.
had to go there to find out if it was her or not. I mean, it's one of those crazy stories that might be true because when
Yeah,
you're bluffing and lying, you want your story to be sort of on the
yeah. And
edge, right? So it's like, oh, that's almost crazy that it could be true, right?
believe him. I mean, he heard them saying, only a Frenchman could be so
Yes.
crazy about a woman, which of course he wasn't a Frenchman, and
Yeah, that's it.
the woman didn't exist, not that woman. But yeah, so that was the beginning of his journey through first Gestapo prisons for 18 months in Paris and interrogations, and then with his a group of 56 prisoners, including about a dozen or more of his agents uh, in his networks, were sent to Natzweiler as Nacht and Nebel prisoners, night and fog prisoners.
Hmm.
And this is the term night and fog has become sort of spread out and, you know, generalized to represent the whole concentration camp experience. But actually, there was a specific decree called the Night and Fog Decree, and it was penned by Keitel, who was head of the German armies, but at the suggestion of Hitler, who, I mean, this is how Hitler ruled, that he would throw out an idea and people had to sort of execute his thought. And his thought came from, after Hitler turned on Russia and betrayed the non-aggression treaty that he had with Stalin, the communist cells that had been dormant during the weird alliance between Hitler and Stalin, then just burst out
Mhm.
into armed resistance. And Hitler at a meeting about what to do about this resistance and the fact that their public executions and advertising them up didn't seem to be working to quell this resistance. So then Hitler came up with the term Nacht und Nebel, which appears in a Wagner opera, and Das Rheingold. And Hitler being a Wagner fan,
Mhm.
and I guess everyone else around the table uh, also being well aware of Wagner, the Wagner understood that Night and Fog represents a moment in this opera. I haven't seen it when someone curses another, and the person who's cursed disappears off the stage in a burst of fog. And
Okay.
so, Keitel drafted this Nacht und Nebel decree, which was one of the crimes against humanity of enforced disappearance that he was hung for at Nuremberg or after Nuremberg. But yeah, so this is a crime against humanity that was recognized by the UN and of course put into play in South America by many of the dictators there who made people the desaparecidos are part of that horrible legacy, and the kidnappings of October 7th from the villages in Israel are also a case of enforced disappearance,
Mm.
which the UN seems to not have recognized as any kind of crime against humanity. But in fact, it's the same idea of terrorizing a civilian population by making people disappear.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that is how his journey to Nosweiler began in July of 1943.
And then how long was he there for in total?
He was there until 1944 in September when the Allies, were moving across France, both from the landings in Normandy and from the landings on the Mediterranean. On
Mhm.
the, and so Nosweiler uh, was emptied of its prisoners, and the living prisoners were sent to Dachau.
Okay.
So Andre ended the war from September of 44 to April of 45 in Dachau and its subcamp of Allah, and then back to Dachau, which, you know, other prisoners besides Andre all said Dachau was easy peasy after Nosweiler.
Right.
Horrible.
Well, that's something worth talking about. We
Yeah.
mentioned this a little bit last night. Is uh, I was telling you that I was talking to a family member and telling him about the book and mentioned Natzweiler, and he said, "Oh, never heard of it." And this seems to be commonplace. Not so many people have heard of this particular camp. It's not one of the infamous ones, and that's interesting and unusual. And what is do you think is kind of behind that? And what's the story there? Why is this one not focused on so much?
Yeah, it is interesting because any sort of rudimentary map of the concentration camps will show Nazi. And so I think there's a variety of reasons for this. Um, Number one is that the French never wanted to call it Natzweiler. So it was the first concentration camp actually that the Allies liberated. Or
Ah,
there were very few prisoners there anymore. There were maybe a few trustees who, had been kept on to help, clean or something. But the documentation was amazing. That was, collected by actually a white Russian, Prince Yurka Galitzin, who wrote the first report on the camp for SHAEF, the Allied intelligence. And it remains an astoundingly valid and interesting document of the camp. But the French never wanted to call it Notzweiler because the nearest town is Notzwiller. So, the SS who ran the camps uh, practically called it Concentrationslager Notzweiler. I mean, that was the official name of the camp. But since the French never called it that, they called it Le Struthof, which is the name of a little farming hamlet on the.
Okay.
So the French, did, it's like a shell game, where they operated, until I think only the last 5 years or so have they sort of officially acknowledged that it was Concentrationslager Notzweiler. But before this, in order to protect the honor of their little town of Notzwiller, they called it Le Struthof. So I
Wow.
think people, scholars looking into the matter, if they, you know, didn't know the history already, couldn't find the camp, it didn't appear on their radar. And also, I think a lot of scholarship of the concentration camps is done by people who have German as their language of scholarship, you know. So they were not able to access the French memoirs and the documentation that did exist in French, which I was able to access because I don't speak German, but my French is, native level. So, I kind of walked into this field of study even before for 10 years before I met Andre. I already, had accessed the history of this camp and felt it was fascinating. The other the other reason that I thought about for some time is that the camp was not exclusively for non-Jews, although the Germans did try to do that. But the population was 80% non-Jews in the camp of prison. And I thought about it afterwards, and I'm still not sure that I'm right about this, but when the non-Jews, if they did survive, and they were pretty much all political prisoners or prisoners of other genocides,
Mm.
like the Sinti and the Roma, but mostly resistors. I thought about it, and I thought when they went back after the war, they went back to families and communities that were maybe not intact. I mean, I don't mean to minimize the trauma, the social trauma of the occupation in France or Poland or wherever it was they came from, because they came from 27 countries in Europe.
Mhm.
Who knew 27 countries in Europe? But the, whereas the Jews had nothing to go back to. And so I think the emphasis on history and memory, maybe among the Jews who survived the camps, was the only thing they had to cling to, or more than to the communities that they could not reintegrate.
Mm.
I mean, if they tried to reintegrate as they did in Poland, they were subject to pogroms, after the war. So, so perhaps that's the reason why, there were fewer Jews to remember Notzweiler than other nationalities. You know, I,
Mm.
I would like to discuss this further, but um, there were more Jews in the camp than were acknowledged, of course, and that's a whole other malaise of memory. But uh, yeah, that was later on in the war toward 44, when the Germans were using slave labor. And so Natzweiler had 50 subcamps that were slave labor subcamps for
50, 50,
BMW.
50.
Yeah, 50.
Wow.
Yeah. And so these were locations where people lived and died and worked in for BMW and Messerschmitt and the SS themselves and all and there's a map in the book of the different industries that employed slave labor based in the subcamps of Natzweiler.
Mhm.
So toward the end of the war, if the Jews were somewhat fit and younger, uh, could be put to work as slaves rather than exterminated,
Mhm.
because the Germans were bleeding out their soldiers to such an extent that they had no more workforce except slaves.
Mhm.
I mean, that's an exaggeration, but there was a tremendous appetite for slave labor in German industry, which the SS supplied. So, they paid, German industry would pay by the piece, which is how they described the prisoners they were working for. And so the SS capitalized on the labor and took the wages of the slaves that they provided to industry in various camps. All the big camps had, I think Dachau had more than 100 subcamps.
Mhm.
The major German concentration camps had a huge, had a galaxy of slave labor subcamps, all each of
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's, I can imagine it being one of those areas of study where it's so terrible you can't look away, but you have to keep looking.
them.
You see what I mean? It's sort of it's such a level of horror,
Yeah,
but you got to acknowledge it. You got to be aware of it, and that can drive that motivation to keep learning and knowing more and studying and diving into it. But
not
a
to
lot of
get
people,
in the morning and say, "Oh, good, I'm going to get back." But of course, having someone like Andre to kind of shine a light, on those grim field of study, and also, Andre refused to work for German industry, so and he always refused to take compensation for slave labor, which is a form of compensation that you know that survivors were entitled to if they had worked in slave labor for the Germans.
Mhm.
But he refused to take that. And when he did, actually, he said, I never worked for the German war effort. Well, you can see in his account of the camps that he actually was pressed into service, not outside Natzweiler, because the Nacht and Nebel prisoners were not allowed outside the main camp. But, well, actually, some of them were, but in general. Um, but, he made sure to sabotage the war effort wherever he went, which he describes in one of the episodes.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think we've been going about an hour and a half now, and this has been a really good kind of overview of the memoir and the stories and the trajectory of this part of his life. Let's um let's just wrap this part of our interview up with a little bit about how he ended up in where he ended up ultimately, because he did, like you said, he got back to France. He got the money that had been given to him for the purposes of gathering and building that intelligence network. He returned it, which
Yeah.
is amazing. That it it was still there, and that he gave it back. And then there was a bit at the end there about how uh, was there some were they trying to redraft the people who'd been in the French army or something, and he said no thank you, and emigrated to the USA, right?
Yeah, he actually he he managed that the way he managed the rest of his war, which is, he heard that he was still in the army, in the French army, and he was, but he was basically executing. He was working on writing his agents into the French government ledger for honors and pensions. So maybe we can talk about that at a later time
Mhm.
because the agents were a whole you know rainbow of French society, and it was quite fascinating the documents that they left him as part of that process. But he, in the army, he found out that his boss, who hated the resistance and actually had probably supported Pétain during the war, was intending to send all of the people in his sphere who had been in the resistance to send them to Indochina. And Andre had had enough of war. Military man that he was. I mean, he stayed. He stayed with the French reserves even after he became, an American citizen. He still, was in the French reserves at Fort Drum, and so on. But he took matters into his hands one more time, and he took it seriously. I mean, this again is, when you have to acknowledge danger if you want to protect yourself. And he discharged himself from the French army by forgery. I mean, to speak plainly about it.
Yeah.
You
Didn't
know,
he he created a stamp, didn't he? And
yeah, like he had to at the beginning of the war to get out of prisoner of war camp, German prisoner of war camp. He forged his boss's signature, releasing him from the French army. And I mean, this is a man who's highly decorated. He has he won the Médaille de la Résistance avec Rosette, which is the highest and the most rare distinction for the resistance.
wow.
Like Josephine Baker, and there are some marvelous, very famous people who have been honored that way. But he met later on, you know, maybe in the next year or so, he met someone that he had, worked with after the war in this process of registering his agents and so on. And the man said to him, "How come you're not in the army anymore?" And he took the man into his confidence. He said, "Well, it's not exactly, you know, a normal kind of thing situation." And the man said, "Let me straighten that out for you." No one had noticed, but on the other hand, it was not something that, you know, it wasn't something that was a good thing to have hanging over his head. So this man, the Gal, the great great resistor, communist, you know, formalized it, formalized
Okay.
his retirement from the French army, so that he, it was all, now it's all fine.
It's all squared away. Good.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, no, this is great. And just as well, I'll just mention one of the bits that I really loved hearing about was he fell in love, right? He met another very intelligent, bilingual or multilingual at least, woman who he married, and I think they had 40 years together, he said, right in the book. And he said they had a wonderful 40 years together. Um, and so just a nice happy ending, right? He moved to America. I don't know what did he. I can't recall. Did he mention what he did for work or what he did professionally from that point on?
He became what his father had been, uh, a merchant,
Uh-huh.
became a shopkeeper, and he owned a store called Babytown in New Bedford that sold children's, furniture and PJs
Right. Fantastic.
and yeah, so he really retired and went back to, you know, a much earlier identity that, allowed him to live in peace and comfort. And he's very grateful. He felt the United States was a country of freedom.
Hmm.
I'm kind of glad he didn't have to deal with what we're dealing with today.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's good that he didn't have to face this as well. So what and just as a sort of final like sort of anecdote, what what age was he and how long did you know him? What was your friendship like? How much time did you get to spend with him? Was it amazing listening to him tell these whole these stories? What was the man like in person when you got to actually, breathe the same air as him? What was that like?
Yeah, well, I did move. I was living in California when I met him, and I moved back to the East Coast to to work with him on this memoir.
Wow.
So, and in fact, I bought a house in the same town where he lived, little tiny coastal village in Massachusetts. Absolutely charming. I never lived in the house because I was studying at Brandeis. I sort of decided that I needed an advanced degree to achieve some kind of gravitas, that would allow me to publish the book with more distinction.
Uh-huh.
So I returned for a degree at Brandeis in French and literary studies, which basically was just, sitting with people, whatever. But yeah, so I got to go through his book with him and read the book. But I feel very uh, remiss that at the time I knew nothing of the resistance. I knew nothing about the secret services. And so there were so many questions
Hmm.
that I had to answer later on. And those answers are in the second part of the book. But, it was, for me, it was at least, my friendship with him has lasted much longer than his life. He died in 2001.
Oh.
But, but then I think the friendship continued, at least for me, through today. I mean, I think he's smiling on us today. And his story and his character, of course, led me to really expand my knowledge of the history that I hadn't been able to discuss with him. But yeah, so it was a friendship that was basically personal, and he knew I was interested. I read the book to him the way I had reorganized it, showed him the chapters, and, but he basically I think he was left with wondering, is this ever going to happen? And, I think he would be happy with it the way it is because he really wanted me. The last time I saw him, he kind of made it was almost a deathbed scene. And he
Mm.
said, publish my book. Poor thing. It was 2001. So it happened 25 years later, or 24. Publish my book, he said, for my comrade.
Wow.
And very few of his comrades. I mean, his comrades appear in the book, but I got to know hundreds more. And so that was made me happy that eventually I did come to, because the National Archives of France were not open when he died. So there was no way to access the history of these other people or even all the work he'd done after the war, registering them as his agent. And so I acquitted myself. And he was very gallant. He was he was always gallant. The last time we saw him, I was with my daughter, who was a teenager in great trouble, and a brilliant and beautiful person who was going through a horrible time. And he uh, he was in bed. He was confined to his bed. But when she came up to say hello or goodbye to him, he took her hand and kissed it the way a Frenchman kisses a lady's hand. And it was such a noble gesture. And for sure he knew her problems. And yet he was paying homage to the bright light that was within her. And that's him.
Beautiful. Wow. Um, I think that's the perfect place to wrap up the this part one. And I'm very keen to finish the book and then hear all about what it takes to write a book, where your research took you, what nuggets you unearthed and uncovered. Just as a final thing, where can people buy the book? Where can they find out about you and follow your work? Where do you want to send them? How could they get in touch? Whatever you want to share with anyone who wants to know more about I Am Andre.
Well, thank you for asking. So I created a website, which I believe will be of interest, although people know a lot more about it now. But it's called IamAndre.live. Instead of .com, it's .live. I
Mhm.
kind of like that ending. So IamAndre.live has links to where the book can be purchased. It's published by Chiselbury in the UK, and it's on Amazon in the UK. And people can email me to, if they're having trouble finding it. The publishers, with Stuart Leeser, is very, very agreeable and supportive. So we'll, he'll help get it into bookstores or wherever you think you want to find it.
And is your email address on the website, iamandre.live?
Yeah,
Okay, good.
I think every page.
All
Email
right, good. People will find it. They can't miss it.
book and email us is, I think, the picture on every page. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for spending this time with us, Diana. And I can't wait for the next one. It'll probably be, it might be in a month's time or so because I'm traveling pretty soon. So I'll have to, I've got plenty of time and no excuses to get the rest of the book read. But I'm very excited to pick this up again and hear more about this wonderful book and this wonderful man and your experience putting it together. And just as a final thing, congratulations on getting it done. Like you said, he told you in 2001 to get it done, and here it is. So that's a major, major achievement indeed. Thank you.